and only open them after 87 days, they will both be glued together. And if I close my eyes for 87 days again and move them around, in 87 days they'd both be glued together, but in a different position. In a mathematical sense, this is differentiating the polar cap with respect to the equator. It's called, Isaac Newton invented differentiation in calculus. So this is what I applied that to, but with rotational variables. And I was able to put a graph together. Once these two were glued together, I could then make a graph of the sun's magnetic field in regard to the Earth. And the results were very interesting. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. But now we know why. We get 7 days negative particles coming to the Earth from the sun. Then we get 7 days positive particles, 7 days negative particles, 7 days positive particles. But what we know is that if these two begin rotating together, the blue one and the equator, because the equator is going more quickly, the blue one falls behind. So that after 1 month, the blue one has moved backwards through field number 1. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. During the next month, the North Pole will move back through field number 2. So if you're on the Earth, you won't see number 2 that month. What you'll see is 1, 3, and 4. The next month, the North Pole will move through number 2. So you won't see number 2 that month. 3, sorry. You will see 1, 2, and 4. So every month, the polar cap burns out one of those sectors. And we see this here, the polar cap sliding backwards, where the particles are both negative and positive as the North Pole slides through them. Now, during the about 1927, a German psychologist, Johannes Lange, did some studies on twins. He wanted to find out if behavior was genetic or whether or not it was caused by environmental influences. And he took 15 sets of twins, and he studied the ones that had been separated at birth, the ones where one twin had gone to America and one had stayed in, for example, Europe. And he noticed that each twin committed the same criminal act at the same age throughout their lives. And therefore he concluded that it must be a function of heredity. In other words, that they must inherit these criminal tendencies. Now, he was almost right, but he was a victim of his own research. Because if we look at the siblings here of the twins, these are the sets of twins, the Ostag twins, the Lauterbeck twins, the Ryder twins, and so on, and the brothers. We have Alan, for example, A, and Kay, for example, Kevin, that at the age of 23, one committed fraud and embezzlement, and Kevin, for him, it was at the age of 26. But the parents had no criminal records, and the brothers and sisters, one had a record, but none had, but he had epileptic fits. When we analyze the data, what we find is we would expect the brothers and sisters to have a criminal tendency, just like their twin brothers and sisters, with a ratio of 1 to 4. But this doesn't happen here. So although Lange was correct, it was genetic, it wasn't necessarily down to heredity. It didn't necessarily come from the parents. In other words, if we had a deck of cards from the parents, the cards could be shuffled up after the parents had released the sperm and the ovum. That's when the cards deck was shuffled, and that's when the personality was created. So I analyzed the 4 types of radiation. If you remember, during the first month of solar activity, we lost field sector number 1. So what we had was, when we didn't have number 1, we had 2, 3, and 4, which was 2 positive, 3 negative, 4 positive. 2 positives and 1 negative means it was positive. The next month, we didn't have number 2, which was a positive. But we had number 1, which was negative, and number 3, which was negative, so we've got 2 negatives and a positive. The next month, we didn't have number 3. The next month, we didn't have number 4. And then they repeated, of course, because once you've gone through the 4, you have to start again. I'm now explaining how astrology works, by the way. A few years later, in 1982, a Professor Ian Nicholson in England discovered that when the particles leave the Van Allen belts, when the solar particles impinge upon the Van Allen belts, the particles go up and down from North Pole to South Pole every 1 second, and the magnetic field on the Earth varies, it modulates. And just after that, in 1989, Dr. Ross Adey, who was President Reagan's medical advisor, discovered that, a team at the Naval Institute at Bethesda, Maryland, discovered that magnetic fields in the overhead lights were causing genetic mutations in their test tubes. So here we have a mechanism whereby particles leave the sun. There's 4 types of radiation. Every month we get number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4. 4 different types of radiation. Those particles travel to Earth. The magnetic field on the Earth changes to either a number 1, either a number 2, or number 3, or number 4. When the sperm enters the egg, the magnetic fields from the Van Allen belts shake up the genes in the egg as it's developing. And what we have then, because we've got 4 types of genes, we have 4 types of personality. For example, fire, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer. And then, of course, the sun gets back to where it started, and it repeats with, we have another fire sign, Leo, followed by Virgo, followed by Sagittarius, or whatever. Forgive me. I'm trying to think ahead. So we understand how the genes are shaken up. Now, this is not new. Here's a stained glass window from Hengrave Hall in England, which is 15th century church. And here we see God the Son with his breath, blowing his breath, the solar wind, onto the earth in the middle here. And we see the signs of the zodiac on the outside. And God has in his hand the sun, the sphere of the sun there. So what we find is that even around 1450, 600 years ago, the ancients understand how the solar wind affected life on Earth and created the 12 types of personality. I then started to consider, it was all very well saying, well, we understand that the sun affects behavior, but how could I measure that? How could I check it? So I considered that perhaps what I was saying was that the sun affects the endocrine system, and that affects the genes when the sperm enters the egg. So is there any other way that I could measure changes in the endocrine system, the hormones, and the sun? So I thought, well, the most obvious measure would be to measure the 28-day signal of the sun and see if any of the hormones, female hormones, change every 28 days. And here we have the sun. We've got 28 days negative, 28 days positive, negative, positive, and I've drawn that out as a sine wave, positive, negative, positive, negative. Now what I'm saying is, does anything happen to the female hormones after day 7, 14, 21, or 28? If there does, then I can say, well, the sun is regulating hormones, and that's the causal agent, if you like. So I had a look at the 28-day cycle of the female hormones, estrogen and progesterone, and I equated these with a follicle-stimulating hormone here, which is responsible for kick-starting the luteinizing hormone and the production of estrogen and progesterone. And on the face of it, there was no, on first inspection, there was no correlation. In other words, I said, what happens to the follicle-stimulating hormone after 7 days? Well, nothing. Not a lot's going on. What happens after 14 days? Not a lot. What happens after 21? Not a lot. Then what I decided to do was, I put this follicle-stimulating hormone graph here, that's this one here, and I put it on top of the 28-day cycle, like so, and I rotated it like so. And what I've discovered was that the follicle-stimulating hormone is switched on day 2.5 of the sun. So as the sun spins, the follicle-stimulating hormone starts to produce the hormone. And then it follows the sunspot cycle for 14 days and stops. On the 14th day, we have the follicle-stimulating hormone, the red one. In addition, we have the solar cycle itself underneath. So we've got 2 cycles which add together. That gives us a pulse in the luteinizing hormone, which is this one here. So we get a massive pulse on day 14, and that changes the amount of estrogen and progesterone